Alright guys, we are up here at the Taft Pioneer Cemetery, and before this fog bank rolls in, I wanted to come and let you know why I'm here, what I plan on doing. So the last 2.5 weeks, I have been MIA on my YouTube channel, and MIA means I've been doing research, and let me tell you what, finding out the history on Lincoln City just sends you down the rabbit hole. A lot of towns usually have one founder or two founders. There's over 50 people that were involved in creating the 8 different communities that eventually led to what is now Lincoln City. I like kind of starting here because history is literally right in front of you when it comes to cemeteries. So Niels Anderson of Kernville headed to Portland in the fall of 1905 to purchase Christmas presents for his family and friends, to have them delivered to Kernville. They were first sent to Newport by train. The plan was to then have them shipped to Kernville by boat, but the captain said the sled's bar was too rough at the time of the year and could not make it into Sled's Bay. Niels got restless and tied empty gas drums to a large boat and decided to attempt to retrieve the presents from Newport himself. One Sunday in February of 1906, so this is like 4 or 5 months later when they first started out, Niels decided that the bar looked smooth enough to try. Niels and his son, Morris, set out. They almost made it out when the last breaker capsized their boat. Niels was sent swimming to shore when he seemed to think of Morris, turned around and tried to find him. Morris came safely ashore, but Niels did not. 7 days later, Niels lost ashore and was found by the mail carrier. The Parmill mill workers helped make a stretcher, and Morris helped carry his father's body back. Mrs. Anderson identified the nearly unrecognizable corpse by his shoes because he cupped one the morning of the accident. John Bones, who owned the property, donated this land that day to start a cemetery, and Niels Anderson was laid to rest. That is how this cemetery came to be. John Bones is right over there. He's here. Parmells, Mrs. Anderson, George and Nanny, Mr. and Mrs. Parmell. They're right here. They're hanging out right next to Niels Anderson. Cemeteries are really cool because it shows history. These towns, the communities, they came from something. So we're losing light. I am going to go home and we are going to start telling you the history of Lincoln City. Buckle up, because it's going to be a wild one. We're not talking about just one town. We're talking about like 8 towns that ended up being 5 towns that ended up turning into one town. A mortuary with bodies in the basement. It's going to be all sorts of weird stuff, so be ready. But isn't that view awesome? Wish I had better weather. It's not raining right now, so I had to come out and get this. Good morning, guys. Here I am. I'm sitting in my game room. I am going to tell you the story on how Lincoln City was formed. And now, bear with me. Don't leave just yet. Grab a food item, your favorite cold snack, sit down, and let's get into it. I am going to talk about how 8 different communities eventually merged into one. In order to tell this story, we have to go back, way back, like 1850s, earlier kind of back. Now, in 1837, Reverend Jason and Anna Lee honeymooned at what is now Devil's Lake State Park, creating the first tourist destination while on mission converting and assimilating natives of the area to Christianity. He would actually lose his wife and their newborn child a year later, but while they were here, they became the first tourists to the area. Now, I want to say 1849, this guy, Lieutenant Theodore Talbot, reported a diminished native population while he was camping at Freedom Rock, while on the second mapping expedition trying to navigate and plot the Siletz River. Back in the 1850s, Wacoma was actually used as a native burial ground. Now in 1853, a battle broke out between the Yaquina tribe and the Rogue River tribe over fishing rights for Devil's Lake and Dee River. In 1855, this guy right here, Franklin Pierce, he signed an executive order establishing the Oregon Coast Reservation. Now this order would relocate Southern Oregon and Northern California natives out of fertile farmlands for homesteaders and would change the lives of the native people forever. Now in 1856 was when the first natives arrived, but actually populations fell fairly quickly due to insufficient foods and supplies that was actually promised by the government. Now in 1887 was a very big year. So 1887, the government actually passed the Dawes Act. Now, the Dawes Act allows the president to oppose land ownership on natives, which was never part of their culture, philosophy, or heritage. It was also created to help shrink reservation lands and sell the remaining land to homesteaders for profit. Now, in 1894, the Siletz tribe finally recognized and accepted the Dawes Act, which officially made the first natives of the area the first settlers, because in turn that granted them 80 acres per tribal member to establish a property on, a homestead on. 80 acres wasn't even half of what a future homesteader could claim after 3 years of improving the land. Now, to talk about the history of Lincoln City, we also have to talk about North Lincoln County as a whole. Now, the first actual European settled town that had a post office was Kernville. Kernville was established by the brothers Daniel and John H. Kern just outside of what is today the Lincoln City limit, 1 mile up the Siletz River. The Kerns constructed a cannery called the Kern Brothers Packing Company, and later that year they built a general store with a post office that also had several cabins for workers. 1899 was a big year for the beginning of Lincoln City when George and Nanny Parmell purchased land from Jackie and Sissy Johnson. Jackie and Sissy Johnson, which were the first settlers who received 160 acres under the Dawes Act. Jackie and Sissy's parcel was the area that is now the Taft Bayfront. The Parmells would actually start the first town inside what is now Lincoln City and was named Johnson after the native couple. The post office was in use from 1899 until 1903 when the Postal Service transferred over to Kernville. 1903 was the first year when the Parmells actually constructed the first school in the town of Johnson. Now, in 1904, Charles P. Nelson, he was actually a mercantile store owner out of Cloverdale, which made regular trips from Tillamook to Siletz Bay with his ocean vessel, the Della, to bring goods and food to the area, and contacted John H. Bones to start a store on consignment and would provide supplies. Steamboats also became a regular sight in the Siletz Bay as they would be dropping off prospecting homesteaders, mostly of Finnish descent, because local companies were offering free land for those willing to work hard and endure the harsh environment. This region also reminded the Finnish people of their homes back in Finland. Now, in 1904, the Parmells also constructed a store down in the town of Johnson and used Nelson's as their merchant as well. Now, Georgia Mary Cutler, shown here, also purchased a large parcel of land in the Siletz Bay from Charlie Depot, who received the acreage under the Dawes Act, which would eventually become Cutler City. Now, in 1905, Matt Kangas bought an 80-acre parcel just south of the Cutlers to later move from their homestead on Devil's Lake to start a dairy farm. You'll hear a little more about them later on in this story. Now, in 1906, John H. Bones finally finished his store in the town of Johnson. Now, the store was a big deal because the store would also have a post office. Bones also became the first postmaster, and he named the town Taft after William Howard Taft, but not while Taft was president. It was when he was the Secretary of War. That very same year, Charles P. Nelson, the guy that was selling goods, and decided he wanted to walk home one day. About a mile up the beach, he noticed an opening in the small cliffs, which opened up to a small lush valley. This would later become the site of Nelscott. Now, 1911 saw the first bridge in the area get built. Now, that bridge was a pedestrian suspension bridge that was established to help transport people from the town of Taft to Cutler City. The only other ways to literally walking through low tide or taking a horse and wagon across the river. Jackie and Sissy Johnson were always out there helping people get across the river. And then you could also see George and Nanny Parmel as well out there helping people cross the river. The suspension bridge really did help the town because they no longer had to traverse the river. Now in 1919, Matt Kangas and his family actually moved from their homestead on Devil's Lake down to the site in Cutler City to start the Spruce Sylvan Dairy, but locals always called it the Kangas Brothers Dairy. They actually changed the name to the Kangas Brothers Dairy. Now in 1923, down in Taft, the Bones store was actually bought and sold, and it actually exchanged hands and then sold again. Now, Fred C. Robinson, he purchased the building and relocated it to the Slets Bay Trading Company. That building still actually stands on the corner of 51st Street and Highway 101 to this day. Now in 1924, 3 small towns popped up. So D-Lake had its own post office and was named for how the Finnish people said, "We are going to D-Lake." It was also where Herbert and Edna Rexroad, shown here, who with the help of their business partner Edgar Hoyt, was able to buy an 82-acre parcel of land and create the town of Devil's Lake Park, which had its own business district and built the first home, and then also built the Devil's Lake Park campground, which still exists to this day. Now that same year, on the northwest side of what is now Highway 101, John and Mary P. Sachs donated 80 acres to a Catholic priest named Charles Raymond with the idea of creating a resort-like community. After ties broke with the church and bishop over the commercial development with the church, theater, and other structures, when funding was lost, the town of Raymond actually merged with the town of Devil's Lake Park. Now you remember that guy Charles P. Nelson? In 1925, that was the year Charles Nelson and Dr. W.G. Scott set out to find land to start a resort. The land that Nelson found while on his walk had a 170-acre lot for sale for $4,000, which is like $69,000 today. They purchased that land and founded Nelscott Beach, and the Nelscott Land Company was formed to sell land to future homeowners. This same year, the Kernville store was actually built and completed by Ernest and Georgia Bones. Now in 1926 was a big year. The town of Raymond and Devil's Lake Park merged. They created their own post office with A.C. Duell as the first postmaster and renamed both towns Ocean Lake. Now that name actually came from Mrs. H.E. Warren, who is credited with saying it lies between the ocean and the lake. At that time, Ocean Lake was the only town named that. Now in 1927, Frank Hallott actually built the Nelscott Cash Store for Charles P. Nelson and was in the heart of Nelscott. It was a general store, had offices, a bus depot, a parlor, and then in 1929 housed the post office. Now when you think of Nelscott, because Charles P. Nelson and W.G. Scott, they built the company to buy and sell land to other people. A lot of the early growth was actually done by George and Anna Cushing, who cut and burned trees, built a campground with cottages, had tent houses, established the first gas station in the area, and a large community kitchen, which is still standing to this day as the Eagles Lodge. Now this same year, just north in another town of D-Lake, is where the D-Lake School was constructed. But by 1930, it still was unfinished, had 4 grades per 1 classroom, and did not have restrooms. It had outhouses out back. Now in 1927, the Schooner Creek Covered Bridge actually finished construction, which had replaced that pedestrian bridge that was established linking Cutler City to the Taft area. And that bridge would inevitably get replaced by the bridge that is standing there today. Now, just a year after, the town of Ocean Lake was established by combining Raymond and Devil's Lake Park. They actually annexed D-Lake into Ocean Lake in 1927. In 1928, the Pines Hotel opened its doors and was the place to stay in Taft for over 25 years. A disaster actually burned the building to the ground in 1976, and that lot is now home to the Pines Dine food truck court today. This year also saw the final piece of the road network get constructed down on the south side of town, south of Cutler City. Where the Kernville store was built, there was a steel drawbridge that was finally linking the southern strip of road from Newport to the northern communities of what is now today Lincoln City. The building and bridge, unfortunately, in Kernville no longer exists today. The only thing that remains is an old alignment that you can see on Google's map, and then one power pole that has nothing attached to it. Now, a new larger bridge was actually constructed in 1973, which was a little farther downriver and is now today's new alignment. When that last edition of the road network was done, Cutler City was ready. They had the Cutler City Auto Camp and Cutler City Art. They had C. Munker's gas station. They had Norville Moore's General Store, and the Crab Pot came soon after. Also in D-Lake, Harry Mercer built the Seven Gables cottages. Now, the building changed hands over time. It was originally known as the Old Indian Trail Cottages. There was an addition planned by new owners which would change the name to 11 Gables, but that fell through. So in 1946, the name that we all know to this day, which is the Seven Gables Cottages, still exists to this day across the street from the old D-Lake School. Now, 1929 was kind of interesting. D.N. Hendricks actually purchased a 10-acre parcel of land in what is now today Rhodes End from Louisa Logan. Louisa Logan was one of the original settlers in that area, was given acreage under the Dawes Act. Logan Road, Logan Creek were all named after her family. Now, the peas that Hendricks would actually plant and grow on that parcel of land were resilient to cold and moisture climate and would take them to markets in the Willamette Valley. Later on, the farm wasn't producing as it was, and so he was selling off parcels for future homeowners for $500 a lot. Now, this same year, Charles Walker actually wanted to create a hotel that reminded him of an old English country inn. So construction work began on the Dorchester House, which was the most recognizable building in the town of Oklahoma. Unfortunately, it was not finished until 1935 due to the Depression, but over the years it has been added on to in multiple renovations, but the original building still stands to this day. Another building to note was the Green Acre Cafe. That was constructed in 1929 by Manville Robinson. Manville Robinson made it a popular restaurant, and during the war years was the place to be for military personnel. Now, in 1930, the Port of Newport actually built the Taft Boat Dock, which quickly became the hub for fishing, boating, and log hauling. The Chahunto and the Dodeco were two tugs that were stationed there regularly and often seen moving logs from the Kernville and Millport mills to open water to transport to Newport or Tillamook. And due to tides and changing sandbars, would regularly get stuck and create quite the spectacle for onlookers. Cutler City in 1930 actually became the next town that constructed its post office. Robert Craddock built the Craddock Cottage. They originally started as 8 units, but eventually became 22, and during World War II housed the Coast Guard Beach Patrol, and the buildings are still there to this day. Now, in 1931, the business owners in Taft wanted to promote Taft, so this started the competitions between the towns, and in 1931 was the first year of the Redhead Roundup. 1931 to 1941, by the time the last year was held, it had become a 2-day event in which over 25,000 visitors would attend. Entertainment was the focus, which included comic skits and dances by local natives under the supervision of Chief Running Wolf. The biggest event was the rounding up of redheads. It was a beauty pageant. There were many prizes and awards offered. The only regulation was that they were natural redheads, but that rule was never really upheld. Now, in 1931, Matt Kangas, you gotta remember, Matt Kangas, he finally built a barn to house 40 of his high-test milk cows. Now, Matt Kangas made a name for himself and the dairy farm because they had some of the best milk and cream in the area. That barn still stands to this day and is located just south of the Cutler City entrance. Now, in 1932, the Nell Scott Cash Store decided to expand to the south, which included Earl's Bookshop. That was once described as one of the best in the nation. The expansion is actually known today as the Nell Scott Strip. Now in 1933, the first regatta was held on the lake and was promoted by Edgar Merritt based on the idea to encourage tourism by highlighting the natural attractions. Now, Devil's Lake was an ideal venue for swimming and boating competitions. The first regatta had 15,000 visitors. Crowds increased every year until 1941 with the start of World War II. It was a huge event that included boat races, swimming, log rolling competitions, parades, and concerts. Devil's Lake is still actually recognized as one of the fastest lakes in the world and still does drag boat races every year. Now in 1935, Wacoma Beach was actually established by W.H. Longcamp by purchasing a parcel that was owned by the John Morris family, which they received under the Dawes Act. Now, Wacoma actually means sea or big water in Chinook. Now, a couple buildings to note in town was actually built in the mid to late 30s. The first building that I'll talk about is actually Robert Ballard's, who started Ballard Motors in 1945, built the building that still stands to this day as the Lincoln City Glass Center. It too exchanged hands over the years and was two other dealerships before in the early 2000s was renovated as an urban renewal program. 1937 actually saw the Lakeside Theater get built. It was built by William McKevitt, which is now the Bijou Theater today. First admission was 35 cents, and the first showing at the theater was personal property of their own recording. This one gets a little weird because in 1938, Leo Bateman actually wanted to create a mortuary in the area. It changed hands over the years with renovations and additions added to the building over time and was purchased in 1980 by Dale Almsberg. Now in 1984, it was discovered that Dale Almsberg actually had 60 bodies in the basement and in mass graves at the cemetery because families were paying for cremations, but he would never actually do. 1941 through 1945 seen a huge influx of military personnel to the area, and all of the places that could house them were filled to maximum capacity. Service personnel were sleeping in hotels, motels, auto camp. It was not uncommon to see military vehicles driving through town or blimps patrolling the beaches searching for Japanese subs or mines. Now in 1945, Wacoma was the next town to actually get annexed into Ocean Lake. Some parts of Wacoma actually changed their name to Wacoma Beach in 1949. Now in 1948, the residents of the former Wacoma area that were actually annexed into Ocean Lake prompted the locals to petition to unify all the towns in the area. It gathered steam in 1953, and then in 1955, with a court case between Wacoma and Ocean Lake, was the idea to stop competing for business and to have government utilities and spending under one roof to provide citywide utilities, police, healthcare, and education. Now on December 8th of 1964, all 5 town sites of Ocean Lake, D Lake, Nelscott, Taft, and Cutler City all voted after several failed attempts, finally decided to become one town with the deciding factor of 3 votes from Taft. The new town name could not have been any of the former town names, so proposals for the new town names were Miracle Beach, Holiday Beach, Surfland, Lincoln City, and Miracle City. Now back to the 40s and 50s. There were still industry as logs and materials were still being moved by boat and truck now. Attractions in the area like the Ocean Air Speedway was a quarter-mile dirt racetrack. There were several marinas that dotted the lake like the Calkins Boat Works being a boat builder, and the Anchorage, which was a kind of drive-in boat restaurant, and the D River boat rentals that were right next to the D River Bridge. Logging was still big in the area, with parades showcasing the size of the trees still coming off the mountains, sometimes needing 8 trucks to haul one tree because they could only handle 1 log at a time. Taft had the roller skating rink, which is now part of the South Ace Hardware building. Ocean Lake had the Lakeside Theater and Dance Hall. The Swan Drive-In opened its doors in the 60s and on the land that the mall exists on to this day. Other great places to go and see were Pixie Kitchen, which the owners actually had started an amusement park park in 1969 outside of town called Pixieland. Now, Pixieland opened its doors in March of 1969 and continued operations until 1977. It had a log flume ride, it had carnival style rides, it had an opera house, it had a main street with restaurants and shops. One of the coolest things was a 1890s half-scale replica locomotive, which would traverse the outside of the entire amusement grounds. Even though the park has been gone for almost 50 years, that locomotive, which was known as Little Toot, is still in operation today and can be found at the Lagoon Amusement Park Wild Kingdom in Farmington, Utah. The 1970s to the 80s, growth actually slowed. No mills were still operating in the area, canneries and fisheries were gone, lumber wasn't leaving by boat anymore. Attractions came and went through the years, but nothing really stayed because of how harsh the winters were with no tourism. Lincoln City to this day is still fighting for an identity and is still trying to figure out how to grow. It is still struggling with public works and infrastructure. The largest annexation in recent years was when they annexed Rhodes End in 2013 by actually informing the homeowners that their water service was going to be shut off until they consented to the annexation. Now, the mid-90s actually saw a really big refresh of local tourism and growth. Schnookwan's Casino, which became the largest event center in the area. It hosts concerts, boxing, gambling, comics, and more. With the increased tourism, it is bringing people back to the Oregon coast. Also, the open air mall was constructed roughly in the same time, and to this day is still a popular tourist destination. 1993 was the first year when they integrated grass carp into the lake to help suppress the plant growth within the lake. One of the biggest issues today is how to save the lake and how to control the blue-green algae blooms that towards the later half of summer shut the lake and Dee River down, because blue-green algae blooms, you cannot swim in it, you can't get it on your skin, you can't have it in your eyes or mouth, so the lake actually shuts down completely. I believe that if the lake's entire watershed was under protection and that the leaching septic tanks were removed, we could resolve the Devil's Lake problem and bring it back to its former glory. Now, Lincoln City today, this town has great history with plenty of things to see and do. If you like nature, we have parks, gardens, nature trails, easily accessible. If you like to spend money, we have a casino, we have the mall, we have 2 kite festivals every year, we have 3 fireworks shows every year. If you need a place to sleep for the night, we have more hotel rooms and beds that could sleep the year-round population of this town. You just want to come to the coast for the day and grab something to eat? We have over 93 different places where you and somebody else could potentially sit down and grab a bite to eat. I will say that if you do want to come to Lincoln City, definitely check out the history. There is so much information and so many people that contributed to the forming of all of these towns that I could not personally make a video large enough to explain the way this town was formed. Please, if you guys stop and you guys want to come to Lincoln City, go to the North Lincoln County Museum and check it out. The museum is actually in the former fire building of Taft. And when Taft was annexed to form Lincoln City, the city hall that was there as well also moved, which made that building vacant. So hopefully this video will come to you guys slightly polished. I know while making this video has been a lot for me because I'm not trying to just research one town. I am researching multiple towns, trying to put a timeline together for you guys, and also trying to get it across without being as choppy as I can make it. So if you guys like the history on Lincoln City, please comment down below. If you guys know more information about the town that I don't know, drop it in the comments below. I originally, when I started this YouTube channel, I have no idea where the channel is going to go. Lincoln City has one of the coolest places on the Oregon coast to come hang out and stay. We have the Nell Scott Reef, which was, I think, like 2003 Surfer Magazine's best places to surf in the world. There's so much information running around in my head. Hopefully this video will not get butchered as bad as I think it's gonna get butchered, but this is my first attempt at trying to create a history video, and hopefully you guys enjoyed it. If you guys have more information on anything that I might have possibly missed, go ahead and drop it in the comments. There is so much of this area that I didn't even talk about. I didn't even talk about the towns that are just outside of town, like Niatsu and Otis. It is crazy to think the amount of history that surrounds us day to day, yet we do not have the time to appreciate people that were here before us to create these things. Because if it wasn't for them, we wouldn't have the street that I drive down every day to come to my house. If it wasn't for them, we wouldn't have the schools built in the area that you could send your children to. If it wasn't for them, we wouldn't have sewer, we wouldn't have water. These were all things that they produced and grew and growth, and it was just insane to think that this town started from a horrible situation when the federal government was just moving tribal members off their lands and putting them in such a hospitable location that even they couldn't survive living out on the coast. And the coast is still violent to this day. A lot of people out there won't understand the weather that we get here, and I get it. You could be 7 miles inland and have 30-degree warmer temperature and blue skies, and we could be in 40-degree weather, fog, and rain. This was a very inhospitable area, and still to this day can create some of the craziest weather that can be seen on the Oregon coast. I appreciate you guys for checking out the video. Hopefully you enjoyed some of the history and how this town came to be. So